Much of what we'll be seeing today is the architecture of 1870 to 1920. Just in terms of where we are now, standing out in front of Somerville City Hall. Essentially what happened was that the City Hall started out as a two-story T-shaped high school building in 1852. In 1866, the town government moved from the Forster School that was on Sycamore Street, and it moved into the second floor of the old high school building. And then in 1896, the first of two north wings on this side got built. And so what you have going on here is in 1873, the police department leaving the town hall to go into its own building on Bow Street, the building that's still there that became condos not so long ago over on Bow. And then you have the library coming into the police quarters in this building. And then in 1885, there's a new library which stood where this wing of the high school is, a kind of a Romanesque revival building that you can see in the in books like Beyond the Neck by Carol Zelli that was published in the 1980s, and Anthony Samarco's Somerville Pictorial History book, and different things. So that a library sat here that was very Romanesque and not exactly like the old Cambridge Public Library, but one of those Romanesque libraries. And then in 1923-24, we get the City Hall that we know today. And what happens is that the north wing off to the right is further enlarged so as to accommodate the alderman's council chamber on the second floor. You get the gable roof on the front here lopped off to accommodate a full third floor. And then originally, the main entrance was located on the Highland Avenue side. That was true, from the very beginning with the high school. And then in 1924, there was this thought that this building needed a more impressive entrance right where it is now. This monumental, the Ionic columns fluted, flanked by the brick piers. And also in 23-24, the cupola, clock tower, colonial revival weather vane was put on. So you could say that the City Hall got an extreme makeover in 1924, and it's as we know it today. What we're going to do, and the other thing is that this campus is also an occasion to see really high quality works of civic sculpture. And the very next thing that we're going to do is walk down to talk about the Dilboy, George Dilboy portrait bust down here. Just to tell you about the George Dilboy portrait bust here that was placed here in the early 1930s. This is a work of art by something called the Grenier Studios of Boston. And some further research needs. This is a portrait bust of George Dilboy, who was a Greek American who was born outside of Smyrna, Turkey, in one of the Greek enclaves that was in the country of Turkey. And his parents came to Somerville in the early 20th century, as so many Greeks did, and established their church at the corner of Central and Summer Streets. And this portrait bust is by something called the Grenier Studios of Boston. And further research is needed here to identify which particular sculptor associated with that art concern created this. But the story of George Dilboy is this, that he did a very brave thing and lost his life in the process. He was fighting in Belleau, France during World War I. He was only 23 years old, and he was up on a railroad embankment, and out of nowhere, guns started firing at him, and he ran directly into where the gunshots were coming from, firing all the while, and was mortally wounded, but continued to fight and took out two Germans, and actually caused a whole small group of soldiers, enemy soldiers, to disperse, and then subsequently died. And his parents were presented with a Congressional Medal of Honor by Woodrow Wilson. And it's been said that General Pershing said that Dilboy was one of the 10 greatest American Army fighters of World War I. And his name lives on at Dilboy Field in Somerville, as well as the stadium. So, and he is thought to be the first Greek American killed in World War I. This would have been in April 1918. And the war, of course, came to a close in November of 1918. So anyway, just to let you know about that, and then we'll walk along Highland and talk about the high school. Okay, before I talk about the high school, I just want to point out that we are really in the middle of the city's first park, Central Hill Park, that historically, going back to the 1700s, was really the first Congregational Church of Charlestown lots. And what I take that to mean is that this was like common grazing land for the farm animals of the settlers in Charlestown, or something like that. And then by the mid-19th century, the land up here was owned by Jacob Sleeper, who was one of the founders of Boston University. And there's a Sleeper Street in the Fort Point Channel district that was named for him because he was involved in commerce over there. And so in 1870, Sleeper sold the 38 acres up here to the town of Charlestown, of Somerville rather, not quite a city yet. And so, you know, this is a Somerville Park while it was still a town. And then there'll be a great rush to create parks in the 1890s and early 1900s as Somerville is rapidly running out of land because of house construction. But just talking about the high school, the central part of the high school is actually the 1896 Hartwell and Richardson High School, and the wings are 1928. Now, Hartwell and Richardson are a very important Boston architectural firm, and we're not talking H.H. Richardson of Trinity Church fame. We're talking about a different Richardson who designed the Cambridge City Hall on Mass Ave, who designed what a lot of us still think of as the Exeter Street Theater in the Back Bay, later Waterstone's bookstore, and now some other office use. So this was a firm that did a lot with the Richardsonian Romanesque, but you're not seeing that style here. What you're seeing here is a combination of the Italian Renaissance revival, as seen in the arch with the little keystone and the classicism all around it. And what's missing from this building is the great chateau-esque roof, which burned off in the 1960s, I'm told. So yes, a somewhat altered appearance. And so in the late 19th century, you had the city hall, the old library, then you had a Latin school down in this direction. And I went back and forth thinking, was there or was there not a fire station up here? And as it turns out, yes, there was, even though my latest thought was strike it from the record, but that's not true. At 9 o'clock this morning, I realized there was a fire station down at Walnut where the library is. So a very convoluted evolution up here, to say the least, but with good results in a park-like setting and lovely sculpture to look at. So let's continue towards the library. Now, just to provide some context for this statue, the period between the end of the Civil War, 1865, and let's say 1920 is sometimes called the American Renaissance in the arts. And this is especially true with sculpture. And during this period, Americans attained sort of parity with European sculptors, and in some cases surpassed their European contemporaries, sculptors like Augustus St. Gaudens and Daniel Chester French. Here we have the work of Augustus Lukeman, who was in fact a sort of a student of Daniel Chester French's out in Stockbridge. He's originally from Richmond. And in the early 1900s, he's given the commission to create what is called American Valor, which is a memorial to Somerville Civil War soldiers who died serving in the Army and the Navy during that war. And what it's showing is sort of a guardian angel who is protecting the figure of the soldier here. The statue was dedicated in 1909, and it's just a really handsome work of art. Now, Lukeman's best-known work is a memorial to the Confederacy outside of Atlanta, north of Atlanta, at a place called Stone Mountain. And it's an enormous bas-relief that was never really finished, but Lukeman worked on it in the teens and 20s, and that's his high-profile, sort of his answer to Mount Rushmore or something. And so that's one of his claims to fame, but I think good to stop by and just take a look at this, and then we'll talk about the library next. We're talking about the Somerville Public Library, which was erected here in 1914. The architect was Edward Lippincott Tilton, who started out in his teens wanting to be a banker, and then somehow was hired by the illustrious firm of McKim, Mead, and Wyatt. And he was one of the draftsmen on the Copley Square Boston Public Library project back in the late 1880s and early 90s. And so if you look at this building, look at the facade, compare it to what we recall about the Copley Square Library, you can definitely see similarities, especially on the second floor, that sweep of arched windows and light-hued building materials, which is, what's happening 1890s, early 1900s, this moving away from the so-called brown decades of the earlier Victorian, the dark materials that were so favored, coming into a lighter aesthetic. One of the things that's interesting about Tilton was that he also worked on the Ellis Island immigration station on Ellis Island. And if you've taken that ferry boat ride out to Ellis and seen that incredibly moving exhibit in a building that I long thought looked a little bit like a casino, and then I'm reading about Tilton, and sure enough, he designed in the early 1890s a casino somewhere in New Jersey. So at any rate, He's giving us lively looking buildings, and just to say that one of the great stars of the Somerville public library system in the early 20th century was Sam Walter Foss, who really who really reached out to the community and got people into the habit of borrowing books and attending lectures. He was a poet and quite more than a minor New England poet. Wrote a famous book called The House by the Side of the Road. And so he's part of this library story. At this point, I want to turn our attention to this next war memorial over here. We are looking at a memorial to actually 3 wars that took place around the turn of the 20th century, work by Raymond Avril Porter, who taught at the school that's still associated with the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, right across the street from the MFA. And what this monument commemorates is what a lot of us call the Spanish-American War. First of all, the war to help Cuba become liberated from Spain in 1898. That was, Spain was nearing the end of the road as a colonial power, and there were a lot of, way before Castro, but a lot of revolutionaries who wanted independence. And this was when Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders came into the picture and fought in that battle, and this is the battle where the ship Maine was exploded in Havana Harbor. And then the second conflict is America taking over the Philippines, rousting Spain from those islands, and this is the beginning of America's rise on the world stage as a great power. And this is the time of Teddy Roosevelt's Great White Fleet, which takes a tour around the world and is supposed to show off America's newfound military capabilities. And then the third conflict is very little known, this expedition in China. And what that was all about was there were Christians and foreign folks with business interests in some of the Chinese cities who were being harassed by, I'm not quite sure how to characterize them, but sort of Chinese revolutionaries. China would end its system of being ruled by emperors in the early 19-teens. And so this is an incident that leads up to that. And America, Britain, and I think France, and maybe Russia went in to remove Christian missionaries and basically people who had business interests from the West, to take them out of China so that they would not be harmed. And I think this is sometimes called the Boxer Rebellion, and I meant to find out what that reference is. But 3 wars, one with Cuba, very well known, the other 2 maybe not so much, but with a work by Raymond Porter. So let's head out towards Walnut Street. Okay, we're looking at 67, the orange and buff trimmed house across the street, which was built during the 1860s. It does not appear on the 1857 Somerville map, and we know from a deed that it is here by 1865. And so this is just to make the point that even during the Civil War, house construction continued apace in the town of Somerville. And the third owner by the 1880s was a member of the Ireland family, whose family has deep roots in Somerville, going back well before the Revolution. And there are two late 1700s houses, one on Somerville Ave, opposite Dane Street, and one near Buddy's truck stop that were Ireland houses, old farmhouses. So this is just where they lived later on. And it's a good example of an Italianate house. Italianate style is popular from the 1840s into the 1880s. And you can think of it as the American folk art version of Italian Renaissance architecture. It's kind of a trickle down from very formal, fancy architecture. It's probably heresy to say that I like the colors. Not exactly historic, but my thought is, you know, get paint on the building rather than modern siding, and just get the elements protected by a new coat of paint, and have an understanding of what would be appropriate colors, more in the way of earth tones, chocolate browns, forest greens, colors that kind of blend in with the landscape. I also want to say a few words about Walnut Street, which is one of 11 historic rangeways in Somerville that begin with Franklin Street in East Somerville and extend every so often all the way to North Street in West Somerville. So streets like Central and Cedar and School and so on are rangeways. And what these streets did was they ran between Somerville Ave, Washington Street, and Broadway, and they provided access for the farmers who had farms in the middle of Somerville who needed to get out to these major thoroughfares to send their produce or their dairy products into the markets of Charlestown, Boston, and Cambridge. They needed a way to get to those major thoroughfares, and these rangeways provided that opportunity. Okay, now the historic houses on these corners kind of provide a crash course in learning about historic architectural styles. The White House on the corner was built about 1850 for Ira Hill, who was one of the kind of original families up here when Prospect Hill starts to develop with housing right around 1850 on either side of that date. And Ira Hill was a major kind of real estate magnate who owned a lot of the land further down the hill that borders Columbus Avenue. And what the White House started out as was a Greek Revival house. And then later on, it acquired a Colonial Revival wraparound porch and had kind of a Victorian two-story bay window off to the right on the Boston Street side here, bumped out. So it's kind of acquired later features, that Colonial Revival attic window, what's called a Palladian window, with the very distinctive center arch. That I take to be part of this sort of turn of the 20th century Colonial Revival thing that was going on with the house. But it is a very, painted an appropriate color for a Greek Revival, white. Greek Revival was big on whites, light grays. Those houses were meant to be served up on a hilltop and called out in a bright color to differentiate it from the foliage going on around it. Then over here at 48 Walnut is a mansard style house of about 1870, and it's important to keep in mind that between the end of the Civil War and 1873, when there's a terrible economic downturn, a stock market crash, the house construction is going full tilt. It's a very productive time in America. All the war effort basically encouraged and created new industries, and people had money right after the Civil War and could build a place like this on a hilltop that was owned by a George Simpson, who was a local businessman. And the main thing to think about is this double-pitched roof. The mansard was somewhere between a full top floor and an attic, and it was typically where servants lived in a house like this. And then looking diagonally across sort of to the northwest here on the corner with the towered effect here, this is a fabulous Queen Anne two-family. Each unit had 12 rooms and built for Moorhill's George Hill and his son. So maybe that's the son of Ira and grandson of Ira living there beginning about 1890. And the Queen Anne is a historic style that's usually pretty easy to figure out because of the towered thing that goes on with so many of those houses. Also, the chimneys, as is the case here, frequently have terracotta ornament, little raised floral detail and stepped out brickwork, and then the porches on Queen Anne houses, just as you see here, have the turned posts, the turnings, and those turnings could be, mass produced, sent to the building site. You could pick those out from a catalog. And so, this was luxury high-end housing in Somerville in the 1890s. And then let's actually walk down here so we can get the full impact of this fantastic house. Now, this is the Louisville Niles house, again built 1888 to 1890. Built for a man who did very well as a provisions dealer, what we'd call a grocer today. And I don't think that we know the architect of this building, but again, a Queen Anne house with all the bells and whistles. And in typically Queen Anne fashion, you have a mix of sheathing materials, clapboards and wood shingles. And you get this kind of raised board and batten effect on either side of that angled oriel window. And then this fantastic raised, kind of incised detail at the apex of the gable. It's just a house that's got this wonderful plasticity. It's pushing out in a lot of different directions, and it's got this very, very substantial approach with these massive granite steps and the shouldered granite blocks as well. Just a fabulous property. I know people wonder about why a Gothic revival crenellated at the top kind of experience for a site that had such strategic importance at the beginnings of the Revolution. And I think the thought was that this Gothic revival symbolizes the old regime in Britain that the American Minutemen turned on its head, overruled during the Revolutionary War. And this represents a design by Ernest Bailey, who, if my recollection serves me well, was more of a civil engineer than an architect. I think that's true.
Yeah, he was the
city engineer.
Yep.
Okay, keeping me honest. And and just to going back in time, this is where George Washington's army was encamped here at the beginning of the Revolution, and the purpose was to keep watch on British troop movements in occupied Boston. This is where the British, or rather the Minutemen, watched the evacuation of Boston by the British in March of 1776. Backing up a bit, coming back from Concord on April 19th, 1775, there was a major skirmish between local Minutemen and British Redcoats who were being pushed back into Boston. Even during the time of the Civil War, there was a Union Army encampment up here. So huge military significance, but overriding perhaps all of that is the fact that the first flag of the United American Colonies was flown here on January 1, 1776. And at first the British, when they saw the flag going up, thought it was a sign of surrender. And in fact, it was just the opposite. The colonies were more united than ever before. And there's a wonderful flag-raising ceremony reenactment every January 1 at noontime, which you all really should make a point to attend. It really is a wonderful event. And this is one of the great, affords one of the great views of the Boston and Cambridge skyline. And at first it was called Warren Street, and then it was called Highland Street. And I guess the thinking was that there was already a Warren Ave and a Highland Ave, so make life less confusing by naming this after Christopher Columbus in 1880. And this is one of the best places to see the mansard or Second Empire style in this state. And let me explain that the mansard style is all about a very distinctive roof type that's actually two slopes, one that you can very readily see, and then another that's usually expressed more down a bit on top of the roof to provide more headroom for that top floor. And it's a roof type that was introduced to the world in France in the late 1600s by an architect named Jean Mansart, and it was revisited in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s in Paris when Paris was transformed, when the street pattern went from being a tangle of medieval streets to having the boulevards pushed through, and lining those boulevards were a lot of houses that had the double-pitched mansard roofs. And so the very first mansard roof in this country was in the south end of Boston in 1847 at the corner of West Concord and Washington Street, that building that's no longer there. But and then the mansard very quickly became stylish and very popular, particularly around 1860. And a lot of the mansards along this street date to the late 1870s, early 80s, so late in this development story. And you can see that the windows have lovely molded enfranements, and a lot of the posts are what's called chamfered, where the edges are kind of shaved down to have less of a hard angle where the sides come together. Lots of brackets. This is sometimes called the bracketed style. This and the Italianate are called the bracketed styles. Rope moldings that you see that accent edges, just a wealth of beautiful carved detail. We are headed towards the Washington Street Art Center to take a look at what used to be part of the Fresh Pond Ice Company and to see the artwork. And we've passed through Union Square, obviously one of the major great commercial centers of this city. This is an impressive sort of west side approach to Union Square with Victorian buildings on either side. The high profile St. Joseph Roman Catholic Church, which was built during the early 1870s, completed 1874. At the time, Somerville had 2,000 Catholics with no place to worship until this church was built. They had to walk into Cambridge and Charlestown and even the north end of Boston to do so. And so for a lot of reasons, that building is significant. Good example of a Gothic revival church. The steeple taken down in 1978, declared structurally unsound. And then over here we have a hidden church, which is now encircled by trees and houses and commercial buildings. It is St. Thomas Episcopal Church, which is no longer operating as a house of worship. It was built during the early 1870s, designed in the stick style, meaning that it originally had this overlay of vertical and horizontal and angled boards that were part of this style, later covered over with a modern siding and completely enveloped by later construction. Stopped being a church in the 1960s. Since that time, it has been home to Hispanic religious societies, as well as nonprofit organizations, social work organizations, and it originally fronted onto Somerville Ave off in this direction. So it's, I want to very quickly point out the I.H. Brown Molding Company, which was built here in the mid-1880s after its original headquarters in Cambridge burned to the ground, and then they moved into Somerville. And what they did here was they made wooden moldings of all types. They made window sashes, they made cabinetry, they even made museum cases for the Agassiz Museum of Natural History at Harvard University. So, we can't really see it through the glare, but as we walk by it, take a look off to the side here. On the right, the I.H. Brown Molding Company originally. We're now about to visit the Washington Street Art Center, which originally was part of the Fresh Pond Ice Company operation. This is Lee Kilpatrick, who is the director of the art gallery. And this building that I think many of you received this postcard, that's the building across the way. And what Fresh Pond Ice was here was that it was an ice storage and distribution center. And this harks back to the ice harvesting that took place on Fresh Pond in Cambridge. And that was an operation that started around 1840 with the Boston Ice Company that was founded by Frederick Tudor. And that's a totally separate company from Fresh Pond Ice. Tudor's company was involved with the shipment of ice to the Charlestown waterfront and then to as far away as the West Indies, the Caribbean, and even Calcutta, India. And the ice was packed in tall ships that had tin-lined holds. The ice was packed in straw, probably something else to preserve it, and somehow made those long voyages, whereas Fresh Pond Ice, which was a newcomer to ice harvesting, that got started in 1882 at Fresh Pond. And what happened was it came in just as the city of Cambridge had plans to turn Fresh Pond into a reservoir for drinking water just entirely. And that meant that the ice companies would have to relocate. And so by 1891, there was no longer an ice company presence on Fresh Pond in northwest Cambridge, and Fresh Pond's base of operations moved to Brookline, New Hampshire, which borders Dunstable, Massachusetts, in southern New Hampshire. And the ice was shipped into Boston and then distributed locally and around New England. It was not an overseas ice shipping experience. And this was made possible in the 1880s by the introduction of the Eddy ice box and similar ice box companies that involved having a big blocks of ice in a wooden sort of tall chest. And so that this ice was more geared for local households, and it was, stored here and then distributed from here, and there were, there was a workforce of, 50 to 75 men and 80 horses with 35 ice wagons. And meanwhile, up in New Hampshire, there were 11 enormous ice houses, and that whole New Hampshire operation burned to the ground in 1935, and then this ceased to be part of it.
All right, thank you for bringing us in, Lee.
Yep. Is this for staff?
No, it's for the city.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Do you want a description of the artist, or do you want more information about the artist?
I'm sorry.
Do you want more information about the artists who do the work?
Sure, if you have.
Well, this stuff is by Megan Creamer, and she does a lot of paper cutting, very intricate cutting, and recently she's been working larger. And these are made of Tyvek. You can see this one. This was sort of done by a folding technique, whereas the one over there was done completely freehand, all the cuts individually. And over here, this is by Alex Feinstein. These are like tattoos, or proposed designs for tattoos. She paints and draws and does that type of stuff. Also, this is her work over there. Over here is Lauren Leone. She does, her work involves, she's a lot of text recently. She does different types of media like embroidery, and this is similar to that with the words, but she's silk screened them on. Usually her work involves relationships and sort of like phrases that would refer to that. This piece, I believe, is using all rap lyrics, but still along the same type of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, see ya. See ya. Thanks.
Okay, for our last stop before Tango Restaurant hosts our reception over on Bow Street, I just want to talk about the George Wyatt brickyards that were once on the site of Lincoln Park here. And just to say that brick making was a huge industry in Somerville from 1820 to around 1880. And it just so happened that the silica in the soil of Somerville was very conducive for making good, strong bricks, and the brick industry tended to be located near waterways, and you're not getting a sense of any water around here, but there used to be something called the Miller's River that separated Charlestown and Somerville from Cambridge. And the Miller's River had associated creeks and wetlands, and it was really a pretty sizable body of water that got filled in the late 19th century to accommodate railroad expansion and industrial expansion and like that. And then
Because it stank to high heaven.
well, yeah, and it was becoming more and more residential. And the land that the brickyards occupied was just becoming so valuable for the purposes of residential construction that the brickyards finally folded. But there were brickyards along the Mystic River. Medford is the town that has the big association with bricks because their brickyards went back to the 1600s. You had west of Cedar Street in Somerville, there were Tufts family brickyards. So bricks were big in Somerville. And the setup here with Wyatt was that there were these long rectangular storage sheds that fronted immediately onto Washington Street here, and then behind the sheds was a row of like brick kilns with associated chimneys, and then the mud pits, the clay pits were occupying where a lot of that playing field is today. And then in the southwest corner was a pond that was filled in the 1890s. So in the 1890s, when Somerville was making this push to get parks before it was too late, they looked at this area and created Lincoln Park, started talking about it in 1896, becomes reality by the early 1900s. And so, you really wouldn't know that there was a whole brickyard thing going on here, and maybe there needs to be a historical plaque or something.